The dust held a single boot print. Not deep, not dragged, just placed there. A man had been walking, steady, calm, like he knew exactly where he was going, and then he stopped. No struggle, no turn, no second set of tracks, just one last step and nothing after. My name's Carter Hale. I used to be the deputy in Cottonwood Creek, and I'm going to tell you what happens when a man walks and never arrives. It was September, I believe. Late September, because the cottonwoods along the creek had already started to turn, and the afternoons had that particular quality to them. Warm enough in the sun, cool enough in the shade, that you noticed the difference when you stepped between the two. The kind of weather where you leave your coat on the porch rail and forget about it until evening, and then you're glad it's there. The man who disappeared was named Harlan Pruitt. He was a surveyor, passing through on his way south to do some mapping work for the railroad company. He'd come into town 3 days before, rented a room from Martha Kinney, eaten supper at the hotel each evening, and spoken to almost no one. A quiet man, tall, thin in the way that comes from spending long stretches outdoors without enough food, not sick thin, but worn thin, like rope that's been pulled taut too many times. He had a leather case he carried with him everywhere, the kind that holds maps and instruments, and he kept it close the way some men keep their hats close. Not out of fear, but out of long habit. I spoke to him once. The evening before he vanished, I was making my last pass down Main Street, checking the latches on the Mercantile and the Land Office, and I saw him sitting on the porch of the boarding house, just sitting. His chair was tilted back against the wall, and his boots were crossed at the ankle on the railing, and he was looking out at nothing in particular. The street, the sky, the slow darkening of the hills to the west. He had a pipe in his hand, but it wasn't lit. He was just holding it, turning it over between his fingers, the way you turn a thought over in your mind when you're not ready to speak it yet. "Evening," I said. He looked at me. His eyes were the color of creek water over sandstone, pale and clear and difficult to read. "Evening, deputy. Settling in all right?" "Well enough." He turned the pipe again. "Quiet town you've got here. We like it that way." He nodded, slow. "I imagine you do." Then he looked back out at the hills, and the conversation was over. Not rudely, just completely. The way a door closes when there's nothing left on the other side of it. The next day, he paid Martha for his room, took his leather case, and walked south out of town along the main road. Martha watched him go from the boarding house window. She told me later that he didn't look back, didn't hurry, just walked, steady and straight, until the road took him past the last buildings and out toward the open flats, where the scrub and the junipers took over. That was the last anyone saw of Harlan Pruitt. It was Martha who raised the concern. 2 days later, she came into the office while I was writing in the ledger, the daily log Sheriff Macklin insisted I keep, noting who came and went, what doors I'd checked, anything worth remembering. Martha stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and that particular look she had, the one that said she'd already made up her mind about something, and was merely informing you of the conclusion. That surveyor man, she said, he left his shirt behind, hanging on the bedpost. A good shirt, too. Not the kind a man leaves behind on purpose. Maybe he forgot it. Maybe. She paused, but he also paid for 3 nights and only stayed 2. Paid in advance. Cash money. What man pays for a room he doesn't plan to use? A man in a hurry, I said. He wasn't in a hurry. I watched him walk out of here. He was walking like a man going to church, slow and deliberate. I wrote it down in the ledger, noted the date, the name, the circumstances. That was the procedure. Note it and let it be, unless something further presented itself. Something further presented itself the next evening. I was walking back from the livery. I'd gone to check on a report from old Emmett that someone had left the back gate unlatched, which turned out to be wind and nothing more. And as I came around the south end of Main Street, where the road leaves town and the buildings give way to open ground, I noticed the light was doing something particular. The sun had dropped behind the ridge to the west, but the sky was still holding color, a deep amber that made the dust on the road look almost golden. And in that golden dust, clear as handwriting, I saw the boot prints. They started at the edge of town, right where the last building, Harlan Dawson's feed store, met the open road, and they continued south, one after another, evenly spaced, unhurried. I followed them, not because I was alarmed. There was nothing alarming about boot prints on a road. Men walked out of town every day. But something about the quality of those prints held my attention. The evenness of them, the calm regularity, the way they suggested a man who was neither looking left nor right, but simply proceeding forward with a certainty that was almost mechanical. I walked alongside them for maybe a quarter mile. The road out there is flat and dry, and the dust holds impressions well when there hasn't been wind. I could see the prints clearly, the slight wear on the left heel, the deeper impression of the right toe where the walker pushed off with each step. A man of average weight, I judged, wearing boots that had seen some use but weren't worn through. And then the prints stopped. I remember standing there, looking down at the last impression, both feet together, toes pointed south, and feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not fear, not confusion exactly. Something more like the sensation you get when you're reading a letter and the page ends mid-word and you turn it over expecting the rest and the back is blank. The ground beyond that last print was undisturbed. No tracks leading off to the east or west. No sign that the walker had stepped off the road into the scrub. No hoof prints suggesting he'd been met by a rider. No wheel ruts from a wagon. Just open, empty ground stretching out toward the flats where the junipers stood like dark figures, frozen in the act of walking somewhere themselves. I crouched there for a long while, longer than made sense probably. I ran my fingers along the edges of that last print, the way you'd trace the outline of something you were trying to memorize. The soil was dry and fine-grained, the kind that takes an impression well and holds it. If anyone had walked through here, anyone at all, the ground would have shown it. The ground showed nothing. I walked a wide circle around the spot, checking for any sign I might have missed. A disturbed patch of earth. a broken branch on the scrub, a thread caught on a juniper twig, anything. But the land was as blank and undisturbed as a fresh page, and the only marks on it were my own boots, circling and circling like a dog trying to settle. When I got back to the office, I wrote it all down. The location, the direction, the spacing of the prints, the point where they ended. I drew a rough map on the back of a receipt from the mercantile, marking the spot with a small X. Then I sat at the desk in the lamplight, listening to the moths tap against the glass chimney, and tried to think of an explanation that made sense. A man could have been picked up by a wagon, I reasoned. A wagon traveling fast enough and on hard enough ground that its wheels didn't leave marks. But the road was soft dust, and any wagon heavy enough to carry a man would have left impressions a child could follow. A man could have walked backward in his own footprints, retracing his steps to town. But I'd followed the tracks from town outward, and there was no doubling, no overlap, no sign of a return journey. Each print was singular and clean. A man could have been carried off by someone on horseback, but there were no hoof prints. None. I closed the ledger and turned down the lamp. Outside, the street was dark and still. A dog barked somewhere near the creek. 2 sharp sounds, and then silence. The wind had come up the way it does in September, carrying the smell of sage and dry grass and something else underneath. Something mineral and old, like the smell of stone that hasn't seen rain in a long time. I stood on the porch of the office and looked south, toward where the road disappeared into the dark. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, just the wind and the faint sound of the creek behind the buildings, and the vast silence of open country at night. The kind of silence that isn't empty at all but full of small sounds, insects, distant coyotes, the creak of wood settling as the temperature dropped, layered so deeply that they blend into something that feels, to the ear, like nothing. I told Sheriff Macklin about it the next morning. He listened the way he always listened, leaning back in his chair, his hat on the desk in front of him, his fingers laced over his stomach. Macklin was a man who gave the impression of being half asleep, even when he was paying the closest attention. His eyes would go to half-mast, and his breathing would slow, and you'd think he'd drifted off. And then he'd ask you a question so precise, it made you realize he'd heard every word twice. "Pruitt?" he said. The surveyor, "Yes, sir." And the tracks just stop. "Yes, sir." Middle of the road, both feet together, nothing after. Macklin was quiet for a moment. His thumb rubbed slow circles on his belt buckle. A habit he had when he was thinking. "Could be he met someone," he said. "Someone with a wagon or a horse. Went off-road. I checked, sir. No secondary tracks, no wheel marks, nothing in any direction. Wind could have covered them. There hadn't been wind. Not that evening. Not the next day either. The air had been still, and I remembered that stillness specifically because it was the kind that made every small sound carry the clank of a bucket at the well. a screen door slapping shut 3 buildings away, a horse snorting in the livery. Sounds traveled clear and far in that stillness, and the dust would have held any mark that was made in it. Macklin looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and picked up his hat. "Carter," he said, "people come through this town, and people leave this town. That's how towns work. A man paid for his room, took his things, and walked south. Maybe someone picked him up farther down the road, past where you tracked. Maybe he stepped off into the brush, and the ground was too hard to take a print. There are explanations. Yes, sir. The tracks aren't a crime. A man walking out of town isn't a crime. Him not coming back isn't a crime either. He's a surveyor. They go where the work is. Yes, sir." He put his hat on, adjusted it. "Let it be, Carter. We've got enough to keep us busy without chasing boot prints. And I tried. I want you to know that. I tried to let it be. I went back to my routines. The morning walk, the door latches, the ledger entries, the evening rounds. I tipped my hat to Martha Kinney and bought coffee from Emmett Greer and nodded to the Dawson boy as he passed with his mule. I did what I was supposed to do, and I did it well. And I told myself that Macklin was right, that there were explanations, that the world didn't owe me a neat ending to every set of footprints I happened to follow. But in the quiet hours, late evening after I'd finished my rounds and the town had settled into its nighttime stillness, I'd find myself standing at the south end of Main Street, looking down the road, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just looking, the way you look at a page you've read a dozen times, knowing the words haven't changed, but unable to stop yourself from reading them again. The tracks were gone within a week. Wind and weather did what wind and weather do. The dust resettled, the impressions filled in, and the road became just a road again, indistinguishable from any other stretch of dry ground, leading away from a small town in the middle of wide open country. If you'd walked out there 10 days after Pruitt left, you'd have seen nothing at all. No evidence that a man had walked that road. No evidence that he'd stopped. No evidence that the stopping was anything other than ordinary. But I'd drawn my map, and I'd written my notes. And at night, when the lamp was low and the office was quiet, I'd take out that receipt with the little X on it and lay it on the desk and look at it the way some men look at photographs of people they've lost. It wasn't grief. I didn't know Harlan Pruitt. I'd spoken to him once, for less than a minute, on a porch in the evening light. He was a stranger who passed through, the way dozens of strangers pass through Cottonwood Creek every season. I had no reason to feel anything about his departure. But those tracks, the way they ended, the completeness of that absence, it lodged in me the way a small stone lodges in a boot. Not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. Every step reminded me it was there. The weeks after were ordinary. I want to be clear about that. Nothing dramatic happened. The town went on being the town. Emmett sold flour and nails and bolts of cloth. Martha swept her steps and hung her linens on the line behind the boarding house, where they caught the afternoon light and glowed white against the hills. The Dawson boy grew half an inch and started wearing his father's old hat. which was too big for him and made him look like a mushroom with legs. The creek ran low, the way it always did in early autumn, and the cottonwoods dropped their leaves into it, and the leaves floated downstream in slow, aimless circles, catching on rocks, spinning free, drifting on. I kept to my rounds, morning and evening, same route, same stops. There's a particular kind of comfort in routine, if you let yourself feel it. Not excitement, not satisfaction exactly, but something steadier than either. The knowledge that your boots will fall in the same places they fell yesterday and the day before and the day before that. The familiarity of a doorknob in your hand. The way the latch on the mercantile clicks when you test it. The creak of the third board from the left on the boardwalk outside the land office. These things become a kind of language between you and the place where you live. A conversation that doesn't require words. I'd start at the north end of Main Street, where the road comes in from the pass, and work my way south. The office was in the middle of town, between the land office and the barber shop, and I'd pass it twice, once going south, once coming back. Each time, I'd glance in the window, see the lamp I'd left burning low on the desk, see the chair where I'd sat writing in the ledger, and feel that small pulse of recognition. That is mine. That is where I belong. Not in any grand sense, not in the way a man might feel about a ranch or a family homestead, just in the simple, physical sense of a body knowing its place in the world. The barber shop was run by a man named Calvin Pettit, who cut hair with the slow precision of someone who believed that time was not a thing to be spent, but a thing to be occupied. Getting a haircut from Calvin took the better part of an hour, not because Calvin was thorough, though he was, but because he paused between each snip to consider the next one, holding the scissors aloft like a painter holding a brush, studying the shape of your head as though it were a landscape he was mapping. I liked Calvin. He didn't talk much while he worked, and when he did talk, it was about small things. The weather, the creek level, whether the Jimson weed was blooming early this year. He never asked questions that required long answers. He understood that some silences are more companionable than any conversation. The land office was locked most evenings. Tom Burrows, who ran it, went home to his wife and his garden the moment the sun touched the ridge, and he locked his door with 2 separate keys, one for the deadbolt and one for the handle, and he checked them both twice before walking away. I'd try them each evening, rattle the handle, press my thumb against the deadbolt plate, and each evening they'd hold firm, and I'd move on. There's something calming about a locked door, something that says, this part is secure, this part is settled, whatever's inside can rest. The livery was at the south end of town, and checking it was the last thing I did before turning back. Old Walt Hoskins ran it, though ran might be generous. Walt mostly sat in a cane-backed chair near the big doors and watched the horses like a man watching a river, with a kind of thoughtless contentment that suggested he'd long since stopped distinguishing between the animals in the landscape. His dog, a gray-muzzled hound named Captain that hadn't earned the title, would be sprawled across the threshold, and I'd step over him carefully, and he'd open one eye and close it again, And that was the extent of our interaction. The horses were calm that time of year. The heat of summer had broken, and the nights were cool enough that the animals slept well, standing loose in their stalls with their heads low and their weight shifted to one hip. I'd walk the aisle, glancing into each stall, not looking for anything specific, just confirming that each animal was where it belonged, that the water buckets were filled, that the hay racks hadn't been knocked crooked. The smell of the livery was one of those smells that gets into you and stays. Hay and leather and the warm living scent of horse, underlaid with the sharper notes of oiled tack and old wood. It was not a clean smell, but it was a good one. The smell of things being taken care of. Some evenings I'd stop and stand with one of the horses for a while, not doing anything, not talking to it, just standing near it in the dim light of the aisle, listening to it breathe. There was a bay mare in the third stall, a boarder's horse, that would press her nose against my chest if I stood close enough, and I'd feel the warm air from her nostrils through my shirt, and her whiskers would tickle my collarbone. And we'd stand there together in the quiet, two creatures with nothing to say to each other and no need to say it. Those were the rhythms of my days, and they were enough. But at night, after the rounds were done and the town had gone dark, I'd sit at the desk in the office with the lamp turned low, and I'd take out that receipt with the map on it, and I'd look at the little X, and I'd think about Harlan Pruitt walking south along a dusty road at dusk, walking steady, walking calm, and then not walking at all. It was maybe 3 weeks later that the second disappearance happened. A rancher named Goss, Eben Goss. He had a small spread east of town. Nothing fancy, a few dozen head of cattle, a soddy he'd built himself. A corral made of posts so crooked they looked like a fence designed by someone who'd had a fence described to them, but had never actually seen one. Goss was a solitary man, the way a lot of ranchers out here were solitary. Not unfriendly, just self-contained. He came into town once a week for supplies, said what needed saying, paid what needed paying, and went back. He had a beard that grew in patches and a hat that had been sun-bleached to the color of old bone, and he smelled like wood smoke and cattle, and a particular brand of dust that lives on a man who spends his days in open country. His neighbor, a woman named Ada Creech, who ran a goat operation on the adjacent parcel, came into the office on a Tuesday morning. She was a tall, angular woman with hands like rawhide, and she stood in the doorway the way Martha had stood. Arms folded, mind already made up. "Goss hasn't been around," she said. "How long?" 4 days, maybe 5. His cattle are pushing against the fence line. They're hungry. Nobody's feeding them. Could be he went to Silver Bend. He's got kin there. Could be, but his horse is in the corral. And his door's standing open. That was enough to justify a ride out. I saddled up and took the east road, following the creek for a mile or so before cutting through the low hills toward Goss's spread. The morning was bright and cool, the sky the kind of deep blue that looks almost painted, and the grass on the hillsides had gone gold with the season, rippling in the breeze like the surface of a slow river. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals in wide, patient loops, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was singing, that falling liquid sound that always made me think of water poured from a glass. Goss's place was exactly as Ada had described it. The door was open, not swinging, just standing ajar about a foot, the way a door stands when someone has walked through it and not bothered to pull it shut behind them. Inside, everything was in order. His bedroll was spread on the cot. His coffee pot sat on the cold stove. His spare shirt hung on a nail by the window. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. The kind of stillness that doesn't suggest departure so much as interruption, as though the occupant had stepped out for a moment and simply failed to step back in. His cattle were lowing at the fence line, pushing their broad faces between the rails. I climbed over and poured water from the trough. It was low but not empty, and tossed some hay from the stack near the barn. The animals settled quickly, the way cattle do when the immediate problem has been solved, and went back to their slow, ruminative calm. I checked the corral. His horse was there, a rangy sorrel with a blaze face, standing in the shade of the lean-to, swishing its tail at flies. The saddle hung on the rail where it belonged. The bridle was coiled on its hook. Wherever Goss had gone, he'd gone on foot. I found the tracks about 50 yards south of the house. They started at the edge of the property, near a gap in the fence where a man could step through without climbing. Boot prints in the dry earth, heading south toward the open flats. The same direction Pruitt's had gone, the same steady, even spacing, the same unhurried gait, and the same ending. Maybe 200 yards out, in the middle of a stretch of bare ground, where the grass thinned to nothing and the soil was pale and chalky, the tracks stopped, both feet together, toes pointed south, and then nothing. I knelt beside them the way I'd knelt beside Pruitt's, ran my finger along the edge. The soil here was different, harder, more calcium in it, the kind that cracks in hexagonal patterns when it dries. But the impression was clear. A man had stood here. A man had been walking, calmly and without apparent distress, in a straight line away from his home. And then the walking had ceased, and the man had ceased with it, and the ground beyond bore no record of what had happened next. I spent the better part of an hour circling that spot, wider and wider, the way you cast a net from the center outward. I checked the brush. I checked the rocks. I looked for scuffs, for drag marks, for the impressions of a second pair of boots or the hoof of a horse. I found nothing. The earth was blank and calm and utterly unhelpful. Back at the house, I sat on Goss's porch and looked south. The flats stretched away, wide and empty, and shimmer in the midday heat. Nothing moved except the grass bending in the wind and a single hawk turning lazy circles against the sky. The silence was immense, not oppressive, not ominous, just immense. The kind of silence that reminds you how small you are, how much space there is in the world for things to happen without anyone being there to see. I rode back to town and told Macklin. He listened with his eyes half closed, his thumb working its slow circles on his belt buckle. Same pattern, I said. Boot prints heading south, stopping without explanation, No secondary tracks, no signs of struggle. Macklin was quiet for a long time, longer than usual. When he spoke, his voice was careful, the way a man is careful when he's choosing his words, not for accuracy, but for effect. "Carter," he said, "I hear what you're telling me, and I'm not saying you're wrong about what you saw. But what I'm telling you is this. A man walking away from his house isn't a crime. A man not coming back isn't a crime either. Goss could have met someone out there, could have gotten a ride to Silver Bend, could be sitting in a saloon right now, spending money he doesn't have, and his cattle can just wait. His horse is in the corral," I said. "Men walk. His door was open. Men leave doors open. The tracks, sir, they stopped. Same as Pruitt's. Same direction, same pattern, same..." Macklin held up a hand. "I'm asking you to let this rest, Carter. Not forever. If Goss doesn't turn up in a week, we'll send word to Silver Bend. We'll make inquiries. But right now, what we have is 2 men who walked south and didn't come back. That's not a case. That's just the way people are. They move on. They leave. Sometimes they don't say goodbye. I didn't argue. You didn't argue with Macklin. Not because he was harsh, but because he was almost always right. And on the rare occasions when he wasn't, arguing didn't change anything anyway. He'd hear you out, and he'd nod, and he'd say what he was going to say. And that was the end of it. But I went back to my desk that evening, and I took out the receipt with the map on it, and I marked a second X, Goss's place, and the spot where his tracks had ended. The 2 X's sat on the paper about an inch apart, both south of town, both on the flats. I drew a line between them, not because the line meant anything, just because my hand wanted to draw it. Then I sat there, looking at the map, listening to the moths against the glass, feeling the weight of that small stone in my boot. I tended to the rest of my evening the way I always did. Walked the boardwalk, checked the latches, stood for a moment outside the mercantile, where the lamp in Emmett's back room cast a warm yellow square on the ground, and listened to the sound of him shuffling around inside, putting things in order for the morning. The town was peaceful. The creek murmured behind the buildings, steady and low, the way it always murmured, a sound so constant it became part of the silence rather than a break in it. A dog trotted past the barber shop with something in its mouth, a stick maybe, or a scrap of leather, and disappeared around the corner of the feed store with the purposeful air of a creature on important business. At the livery, Captain the Hound was snoring in his usual spot. I stepped over him, walked the aisle, checked the stalls. The bay mare pressed her nose to my chest, and I stood with her for a while, feeling her warm breath, listening to the soft sounds of horses settling for the night, the creak of leather, the whisper of hay being pulled from a rack, a tail swishing once and then hanging still. I stayed longer than usual, not for any reason I could have named, just because the livery felt calm, and the dark felt gentle, and the horse's breath against my shirt felt like the only honest thing in the world. When I finally left and walked back to the office, the town was fully dark. No lamps in any window, no sound except the creak and the wind and the distant lonesome call of a coyote somewhere out on the flats. One long, thin note that rose and held and faded like a thread being drawn out of a spool until it broke. I stood on the porch and looked south. The road was invisible in the dark, but I knew it was there. I knew where it went. I knew where for two men now it had stopped going. And I thought about Harlan Pruitt on that porch, the evening before he left, holding his unlit pipe and turning it in his fingers, looking at the hills, saying, "Quiet town you've got here. We like it that way," I told him. "I imagine you do." The wind picked up a little, carrying the smell of sage and distance. I went inside, wrote my notes in the ledger, turned down the lamp, and lay on the cot in the back room, where I could hear the tick of the clock on the desk and feel the coolness of the air through the cracked window. Sleep came slow that night. It often did in those weeks. Not because I was afraid, not because I was anxious, but because my mind had taken on a quality of restless attention, a habit of circling back to the same questions the way a creek circles back to the same rocks, wearing them smooth without ever moving them aside. Where did they go? How did the tracks end? What could make a man stop walking in the middle of open ground and leave no trace of what happened next? I didn't have answers, and in the absence of answers, the questions grew roots. They settled into the soil of my thinking, the way seeds settle into cracks in a stone wall. Slowly, quietly, without asking whether they were welcome. The days continued. The routines held. I walked my rounds, checked my latches, wrote in my ledger. October arrived with a cold snap that put frost on the windows of the office and turned the creek water so cold it ached to drink. The cottonwoods lost the last of their leaves, and the branches stood bare against the sky like the bones of hands reaching upward. The light changed. The long, honeyed afternoons of September gave way to shorter days and sharper shadows, the sun tracking lower along the southern ridge, touching the town with a yellow so pale it was almost white. I kept an ear to the ground, the way deputies do, listened for talk, for rumors, for anything that might connect to those two sets of tracks. But Cottonwood Creek was a small town, and small towns are particular about what they choose to notice. A surveyor passing through and not coming back was hardly remarkable. A rancher going off on his own for a spell was even less so. People had their own concerns: cattle to feed, fences to mend, winter to prepare for. They weren't going to spend their evenings puzzling over boot prints in the dust. And maybe they were right not to. Maybe Macklin was right. Maybe I was making something out of nothing, seeing a pattern where there was only coincidence, hearing a question where the world had offered only silence. But then there was a third, a drifter this time, a man nobody knew, nobody had spoken to, nobody could name. He'd passed through town on a Wednesday afternoon. Martha saw him from the boarding house window, walking south along Main Street with a bedroll on his back and a hat pulled low. She said, "He didn't stop, didn't look at any of the buildings, didn't pause at the well or the mercantile or any of the places a traveler might pause. He just walked steady and unhurried, from the north end of town to the south, and out along the road toward the flats. I found the tracks 2 days later when I rode out to check on Goss's cattle. Ada Creech had been seeing to them, but she wanted to know when someone official was going to take charge of the situation. The tracks were on the road itself this time, about half a mile south of where Pruitt's had ended. Same pattern, same spacing, same calm, deliberate stride, same ending. Both feet together, toes south, nothing beyond. I knelt there in the afternoon light, the wind pulling at my hat, the sun warm on my back, and I felt that stone in my boot shift. It had been sitting there for weeks, a mild irritation, something I could walk with if I had to, but now it moved, and where it settled was sharper, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't there anymore. 3 men, 3 sets of tracks, all heading south, all stopping without explanation, in the middle of open ground where there was no tree to climb, no hole to drop into, no wagon to board, no horse to mount. Just flat, bare earth stretching away toward a horizon that offered nothing but more of itself. I marked the 3rd X on my map. It sat below the other 2, forming a rough line that ran south-southeast from town. I stared at it in the lamplight, tracing the line with my fingertip, and felt something I can only describe as a kind of quiet vertigo. Not the dizziness of height, but the dizziness of depth. The sense that I was looking down into something rather than across it, that the surface of things was thinner than I'd believed, and beneath it was a space I couldn't measure. I went to Macklin again. He heard me out. He looked at the map with its 3 X's. He was quiet for a long time. Then he folded the map and handed it back to me. "Carter," he said, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Let this go. Sir, there's nothing here." 3 men walked south. 3 men didn't come back. That's all we know, and it's all we're going to know, because the ground doesn't have anything else to tell us, and neither does anyone else. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not impatience, something more like weariness, the deep, settled kind that comes from knowing something you wish you didn't, and carrying it so long it's become part of your posture. Some things don't have answers, Carter, and the ones that don't, they'll eat you alive if you let them. I'm not asking you as your sheriff. I'm asking you as a man who's been doing this job longer than you've been alive. Let it go. Go home. Tend your rounds. Live your life. And let those tracks stay where they are. I put the map in my pocket and walked out of his office and stood on the boardwalk in the evening air. And I looked south, and the road looked back at me with the blank, patient indifference of something that has been asked a question it has no intention of answering. And I thought about what Macklin had said, about things that eat you alive, about the ones without answers. I want to tell you that I let it go. I want to tell you that I took his advice, that I folded up that map and put it away, and went back to my latches and my ledger and my quiet evenings in the livery, with the bay mare breathing against my shirt, I want to tell you that because it would make this story simpler, and simpler is what you want when the fire is low and the night is long and sleep is the thing you're reaching for. But the truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that I did go back to my routines. I did walk my rounds and check my doors and write my notes. I did all the things I was supposed to do, and I did them well. And from the outside, nothing about Carter Hale changed at all. But inside, the map stayed unfolded. The X's stayed marked. And every evening, when I reached the south end of Main Street and the road stretched out before me into the dark, I'd stand there a moment longer than I needed to. Just a moment, feeling the wind, smelling the sage, listening for something I couldn't name, coming from a direction I couldn't point to. And the town went on. The way towns do. Emmett sold his flour. Martha swept her steps. Calvin cut his hair one careful snip at a time. The creek ran, and the cottonwoods stood bare, and the wind blew through them with a sound like dry fingers running through dry hair. And the days shortened, and the nights grew cold, and winter came to Cottonwood Creek the way it always came. Slowly, steadily, with the same unhurried certainty as a man walking south along a dusty road. Not long after, I set the badge down. Not in any dramatic fashion, no speech, no confrontation. I just walked into Macklin's office one morning, placed the tin star on the corner of his desk where the sun hit it, and said, "I think it's time." He looked at the badge, looked at me, nodded once. "You've been a good deputy, Carter." "Thank you, sir." "You going to stay in town?" "Where else would I go?" He almost smiled at that. The closest thing to a smile I ever saw on Edgar Macklin's face, a softening around the eyes, a slight easing of the jaw, there and gone so fast you could have missed it if you'd blinked. "Fair enough," he said. And that was that. I walked out of the office for the last time as a lawman, and the boardwalk creaked under my boots the same way it always had. And the sun was warm on my face. And Cottonwood Creek was still Cottonwood Creek, unchanged and unchanging. And I was still in it, and that was enough. I never left this town, never wanted to. Whatever those tracks meant, wherever those men went, the answer, if there is one, is somewhere out there on the flats, in the dust, under a sky so wide, it makes your own questions feel very small. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the land doesn't owe us explanations any more than the wind owes us an apology for blowing. It just does what it does, and we walk on it, and sometimes our tracks lead somewhere, and sometimes they don't, and the ground holds them for a while, and then lets them go. I still walk south some evenings, not far, just to the edge of town, where the road leaves the last building and opens into that wide, quiet space. I stand there, and I look, and I listen, and the wind comes across the grass with that long, low sound it makes when there's nothing to stop it, and the sky deepens from blue to purple to the color of old ink, and the first stars come out, not all at once, but one by one, carefully, like someone lighting lamps in rooms you can't quite see into. And I think about Harlan Pruitt and Eben Goss and the drifter with no name. And I wonder, the way you wonder about things that will never be settled, whether they found what they were walking toward, whether the stopping was an ending or a beginning, whether the silence that came after was emptiness or something else entirely, something full, something waiting, something that the dust covered over the way dust covers everything. Given enough time and enough wind and enough patience, the fire's low now, friend. About as low as it's going to get before it decides to be ash. And that's all right. Ash is just what's left when the warmth has done its work. There's nothing sad about it. It's just the quiet that comes after. Come back sometime if you've a mind to. I'll be here. I'm always here. Cottonwood Creek doesn't let go of its people easy, and I stopped trying to be let go a long time ago. Rest now. The wind will watch the road tonight. It always does.